皆様、それでは午後のセッションを始めさせていただきたいと思います。午後の
We would now like to start the afternoon session. And in this session, we shall be speaking about the Asia Pacific Super Grid. This afternoon session will be composed of two sections. And for this, we have Mr. Masuda, Mr. Son, Mr. Terashima, and Mr. Buntaka Tsagan. And in the second half of the session, this will have Dr. Timo Group, Biamba Saikan Bayajagal, and both sessions will be chaired by Professor Kashiwagi, and Mr. Son will be a part of both of these sessions. So thank you very much for your introduction. And this is going to be a panel discussion. I'm sure I will try to maintain the tension of our speakers. And please allow me to take a seat. And I have been looking at the international infrastructure, which bridges Japan as well as Korea and China. So having such a mega infrastructure would be quite useful for energy security if we could have a very good management of such a network. And I understand that Mr. Son had always had this idea for Asia Super Grid. And that for us to be able to utilize renewable energy to the super grid, then we must have a very good network and very good foundation for this. And I understand that Mr. Masuda also shares that view, especially since we experienced this major earthquake. It is very important that we look into this large grid network, which will be an international infrastructure which will bridge the different portions of Asia. And I think Mr. Terashima will also be able to view his opinion, which will back up these initiatives. And Mr. Masuda, Mr. Son, and myself have published this book. And because we had Mr. Terashima also write an introduction to this book. We have asked that these members be part of our discussion. And from Mongolia, we have Mr. Buntaka Tsagan, and we have many sumo wrestlers from Mongolia. But by having a discussion with our member from Mongolia, I believe that we will be able to expand the scope of this network greatly. And I'd like to see what kind of contributions that could be made from these parts of Asia. So there are four key words which I would like to touch upon as we have discussions today. The first point is, why is it that we need an international energy infrastructure? That will be the first point that we will be discussing, and I hope that I will be able to have views from each of the participants of the panel. And the second topic, because of the globalization that is happening, we would then like to study what kind of changes we are going to be seeing in the Japanese power industry. And when we talk about the renewable energies, the supply of these energies can be impacted very much with the change in climate and weather. But I would like to see how we could make use of these energies backed by other sources of energy to provide the necessary power to Japan. And lastly, I hope that we'll be able to discuss what sort of energy system we should have in Japan so that we can help the areas which had been affected by the earthquake and tsunami and the power reactor incident. So the first topic, why is it that we are talking about such an international infrastructure? And I'd like to start by asking Mr. Masuda. You have proposed this idea of an Asia super grid. And so I'd like to explain you to explain the background as to your thoughts. And I also ask Mr. Sun to continue with the discussion. And so you will be able to see on the screen the direct current grid that we were proposing, which will bridge Australia as well as areas of Southeast Asia and Japan. Because we are an island country, we would need to have submarine cables used so that we will be able to be part of this network. Now, we know that in Europe, there are already such network over the continent, as well as a connection across the waters or the sea to have a broad connection. And so we would like to see how we can try to transpose that idea to Japan. Now, when we speak about energy, we have to look both in temporal base as well as in spatial base. So we have to look at the short range view, the medium range, and long-term reach. And when we talk about spatial scope, we have to think not just about supply within the country, but also across the borders. Now, of course, there will be a case when there is a shortage or a lack of power. And so we are in a state of a crisis. And so I would like to discuss how we will be able to overcome such a critical stage. And these are some things that we have to consider, both from the private sector as well as the public sector. Now, I would like to see how the renewable energy can be part of this grid image, as it has already been practiced in Europe. And in order for such a network to be effective, we must see that there are certain reforms are being made in Japan as to the idea of efficiently producing and transmitting and distributing power. How can we be most efficient in doing this? And so we have to consider how that can be realized as we try to formulate this network. And then when we are going to have this very large super grid, we also have to give some thought to security. And so to what Mr. Kashiwagi had mentioned, I have pointed out these 4 areas to which we would like to direct our discussion. Well, Mr. Masuda, you said that I understand that you are looking to China as part of this. I know that you represent the Japan Policy Council. And so for China, I think rather than start with China, we probably need to look at the ASEAN countries. So Korea and ASEAN will be the first steps in this power grid. Mr. Son, what are your thoughts? Why did you come up with this idea of an international infrastructure? I understand that you have very strong feeling about this. Well, the reason why I started thinking about this was really the incident in Fukushima. We have seen that we no longer can rely on the nuclear power. And I'm sure there are many, many views and mixed views about what you think about the nuclear power plants. So I will not go into that discussion. So regardless of whether you are for or against nuclear power, the truth of the matter is we only have 2 reactors in Japan which are active, which means that we must urgently think how we could introduce renewables. And of course, all of the the thermal power plants will need to be reactivated very quickly. But for medium and long term, we want to aim for having a large percentage of renewables and low cost as low as possible. And we're looking at PV and also wind as well as geothermal to some extent. We would like to see how we can make use of such renewables very quickly in Japan. And so for the last week or so, now there are about 5 plants that SoftBank has announced for PV plants. And we will continue and follow up with more announcements of other projects. However, when we look at the medium and long term, we have to see how we can create these generating capacity more efficiently and economically. So this is an issue not just for Japan, but when we consider the global warming, that this is an issue that goes beyond the national borders, because it is something which need to be considered as a common theme and topic globally. And so where do we find the best wind conditions? We should utilize that for wind power generation, or when where there are abundant sunshine and very large available pieces of land, and it will be most effective to generate power from solar energy. And so we could then make use of the power generated by delivering this over high voltage direct current so that we could make use in Japan. And of course, when we talk about power generation, we only have just a few days in the year which requires peak power. And of those few days, it's just a matter of several hours where we might reach peak power. And but does it mean that we have to have a capacity to meet that peak demand? Because when it's possible that we will have excess energy in most parts of the whole year. And I think this is a common problem that is shared by all parties in the region. But if we are able to work together and cooperate with our neighboring countries, then I think that we will be able to help each other in providing the power to those areas which are in need or where the supply-demand situation is very tight. Now, such a connected network is already available in the area of telecommunications. So can't we do that for power is the thought that I had. Now, Mr. Masuda said that we will be looking to a grid of covering the Southeast Asia nations. However, we can expand that further. For example, the Gobi Desert. Now, if you had the sunshine available on the Gobi desert, then we will be able to get 4 times the demand in Japan. Or there in Gobi Desert, with the wind condition available there, there is a potential for generating 8 times the power demand for Japan. Right now, whatever wind there is, it's being just thrown out. Or whatever sunshine that is available on the Gobi Desert, they are not put to any use. So why not use this? Mr. Son, you're saying that you've already had experience of having submarine cables with fiber optics, etc. So all you need to do is to replace that by power transmission lines, right? Yes, well, we have experience in laying out submarine cables. for communications, then I think in a similar manner, we can also lay down the power cables. Now, it's already done in Europe because all you need to do is to take the cable on both and then extend those cables. Now, in Japan, we do not have that connection, which is already available in Europe. So I think we should not be trying to say that we can't do that. Now, with gas and wire, for example, is a concept that's already available. So maybe we're talking about a fiber and wire. And I hope that Mr. Son, because you are one of the opinion leaders for Japan, that you'll be able to encourage the laying out of such cables. Well, Mr. Terashima, you have heard the two views from our two speakers. What is your view?
Well, actually, the day before yesterday, I was in Washington, New York, and came back. And the end of the year, last year, I also had some discussion with the European people in Paris. Mr. Son is proposing this transcending national boundaries, and this concept is very, very important, which I totally agree and endorse. But based on that, when we look at the reality, how to realize and materialize this vision, which is very important. So, for example, the European example have been referred many times, and you will be convinced when we have that map or something, but there are so much lines like the nest and the network, and it's like the web of the it's growing and expanding in the Nordic countries as well as the European countries. They have done so much efforts. In other words, they had, first of all, the creating the mutual trust, then overcoming the boundaries, national boundaries, like with Korea. And well, that's the reality as well as the what we have to think is we have sometimes we have been isolated from the rest of the Asia to consider such the sort of the various integration of the fuel or network or electricity network in Asia. But in Europe, on the other hand, they have actually overcome so many schisms in the past. I think they have now the euro, the integrated currency, like in Germany. So they are now phasing out of nuclear and they are introducing the renewables. And we would like to actually use that example into Japan right away, but that's different background. For example, that the Germany has, I think, put so much effort in the past to create the trust with France and also with Nordic countries too. Therefore, they can actually have such alternatives to include the new renewables in the power network. And when we are talking about the Asia a super grid or Asia Pacific power grid. But in reality, for example, ASEAN countries, there has been the joint ASEAN project. In other words, the highway sort of vision, like EIT infrastructure highway project was talked about, and they have been trying very hard in 2015. However, in East Asian countries, Japan is the only one, although we talk about mutual trust with Korea and China, but it seems that Japan is the only country struggling to establish such trust relationship, which is quite symbolic in international affairs, because it's probably that Japan has sort of ignored or didn't put as much efforts in creating such trust and friendship with neighboring countries. But of course, we have to come out of the negative perspective. For example, IEA, which is with headquarters in Paris. Japan and Korea are the only two Asian countries as members of IEA. So in this international framework, when we try to sort of discuss, but we haven't got the common forum. So such concrete example like the Asia-Pacific Power Grid or Asia Super Grid, and which has the mutual benefits to be brought in, and then step-by-step mode to establish trust is very important. Like I'm also teaching at university, there is the academic university exchange program with the Ministry of Education. Experiment starts from this year, like Erasmus Vision, we call it. So that is the interchangeable credit sort of the system, so that the Japanese students and European students can actually go over to the counterpart and also gain the credit, which can be considered for the degree. So such sort of task force to have the joint research, probably centered around the young scientists or young researchers, and like the foundation, like the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. Such foundations can actually sort of tap such sort of result of the discussions, and we have to show that. I think the mega infrastructure, well, probably that is what our vision in the future, but it cannot be done overnight. Because 1951 was the first step for the integration of Europe and going into energy. Started with energy, I mean the coal. Coal and steel, yeah, that was the first point in Europe. In other words, that we have to accumulate, we have to build trust so that every partners, every players are convinced that the cooperation is beneficial for everyone. So now we have Mr. Tsagan here from Mongolia. So Mr. Tsagan is the senior advisor to the president of Mongolia, and also in charge of energy and mineral resources. And unless there is a trust, it is very difficult to proceed the multi-countries sort of project. From Mr. Tsagan, your point of view, like this kind of the super grid or this networking with Japan, do you have any expectation and also any challenges we have to overcome? Mr. Tsagan?
Thank you for the the Mongolia or the Mongolian Gobi Desert was chosen by Mr. Son and his team is, I think it is not accidental. I would like to explain in a few words. First, is concerned the potential of renewable energy of Mongolia is, it was explained by Mr. Son yesterday. There is no doubt it can meet all the demand of the whole Asia and China, etc. But there are other reasons. Since I'm from the government, I would like to say some other explanations which are not seen by the professionals. First, as many of you may know, Mongolia moved to this market economy democracy just about 2 years ago. And for the last 20 years, Japan has been helping Mongolia a lot. Just in summarize, the aid and assistance provided by Japan only exceeds all aid and assistance by other countries and other international national organizations. And the aid and assistance were very critical. And because we did the transition from planned economy, from the authoritarian society to democracy and market economy at the same time, peacefully. So therefore, the assistance provided by Japan was critical. So therefore, actually, the Mongolian people are appreciating, value Japan a lot. And actually, we want to help, or we want to cooperate, and we want to do something. And it is not the first explanation. The main things that, thanks to this, our changes, we did so many changes, economic, political, social, including the energy, all this unbundling. Even we approved the renewable energy law in line with this German feed-in tariff doctrine. And a friend of mine even once asked me, why we are doing all these reforms continuously, what we are doing, how we are doing, where we are heading. And looking back our short last 20 years history, I think we did a lot of good things in comparatively during a very short period of time. And thanks to all these reforms in the economic, political, social, radical reforms, Mongolia became a very much vibrant democratic country. And in this part of the world, only Mongolia is a much more vibrant democracy. Even the big decisions, including the investment decisions, not made by one person or by one party, even by one government. It is being, now we have a very much expanded democracy, and the big decisions being made with consultation, through consultation with parliament, with politicians, with people. We are thinking to introduce even direct democracy in Mongolia, similar to the Switzerland. This is a kind of our pride, and also it is a very much guarantee of our successful development. And the third thing is that Mongolia is now, I am one of the few persons who has been involved in all these reforms. And just last year, Mongolia economy, GDP grew 17%. This year will be higher. And this hyper growth will keep in years to come. So therefore, Mongolia is becoming a very much trusted, reliable partner in this world. And thirdly, Mongolia is a peaceful country. We cannot go on war with any, because we have only 3 million people, but we are a democratic country, and we have no enemy. We have very, very good relations with China and with Russia, with Korea, with 2 Koreas. Only Mongolia is a few countries which has diplomatic relations with 2 Koreas. And we have special relations with Japan. So therefore, what I am trying to tell you is that the choice of Mongolia, Gobi, is not only the right in terms of potential, it is very much right in all terms. And in conclusion, I would like just to add one thing. For the last 10 years, as you know, Mongolia have 500,000 nomadic people. They move from one place to other place at least 3 or 4 times. And our government did, not our, I mean this recent, one of the governments for the last 10, 15 years, out of this, all this now, almost 99% of all this nomadic family use this solar panel for communication, for TV watch, and etc. So therefore, even the society, the rural people know the value of this renewable energy. So therefore, there is no doubt. I'm not selling this idea to Mr. Son. I'm trying to encourage and also to invite and to convince the partners or potential partners who have doubt or questions on this grand idea. Sorry, I took too much time.
Okay.
I apologize.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. 孫さんね、いや大変なやっぱ信
So, Mr. Son, there is a great trust already established. So it seems, have you already approached them? Yes. Well, not in public, actually. But Mongolia, I have a few friends, and already we started discussion for the last 6 months, and they started discussion on this subject, this Asia super grid idea. I came up with this idea about 6 months ago, and we actually sort of accelerated this vision by meeting with this Mongolian friends. So going little by little forward. And also, Mr. Masuda, Mr. Terashima talked about the not overnight, but steady sort of the progress is important, he said. Of course, there is like the foreign affairs consideration or the overseas consideration. What should be the process that we should take? Could you elaborate a little bit more from political point of view? What would be the road map? In Europe, 1951, well, until 1945, they were the enemies and allies. But in 1951, within 10 years, they started with coal to have the community. So 60 years since then, that like 10 years ago, they integrated the currency, euro. So that is the intra-national discussions. But I think the first step we have to do is to really present what is the theme of discussion, what is the problem, what is the challenge. Like Mr. Son and myself and Mr. Terashima, we had the electricity crisis. Probably it's not only domestic supply. We have some other solutions like renewables. It's very important to store. Innovation is also expected, but another sort of solution is not storage, but interconnection or the connectivity or access to the network, which actually requires a lot of discussions in international affairs, foreign policies, and so on.
So the next thing that we have to consider is whether we could have a viable business from the private sector or not. It's what the governments are able to spend is limited. So we have to see if we are trying to bring about some reform in the power industry. Do we have that capability of, first of all, creating such a project? And how can we then speak to and discuss this with our counterparties, the other countries? And then once we get to that level, we must be looking to the diplomatic capabilities of each of the country. So are we talking about the energy security just in Asia? Now it is becoming more and more difficult to secure energy from the Middle East. And so this is an issue which will need to be discussed by the different governments. That is not something that you can avoid discussing. Now, when we talk about the renewable energies, I think there is a double level of discussion. For example, there is, on the one hand, these distributed power generation ideas, which can be looked at in the small scales, local terms. But then we need to put together a system that will connect those smaller initiatives. And so to be able to connect that, we need something like a smart grid. In other words, first of all, we had the idea of renewables in the smaller scale. However, now we are expanding this much larger to smart grids, and then further on to an international grid. And so rather than just looking at consolidation of a very small scale generation systems, we have to look at a much larger scale. For example, as was already mentioned, to look to the Gobi Desert for a massive size in the power generation capabilities. So as we said, there are two dimensions to discussing this topic, the smaller scale and the very massive scale. So that means that we're going to have to start with a bilateral or maybe trilateral connection. And I understand, Mr. Son, that there are some initiatives from the private sector to want to start such interconnection. And I suppose that if you cannot make this a viable business in the private sector, then there is not going to be a more long-term outlook internationally. So, are you looking to starting this in a bilateral manner between two countries? Is that your concept? Well, for example, with Mongolia, we have already started our discussions. So we have had some very major and serious discussions in depth. And at the same time, we have also started talking to the power utilities from Korea. I understand that there might be a representative from Korea today to speak to us about that initiative. And then we will need to go through China to make this grid. That means that we are just about to start some official conversation with China, because if it is generated in Gobi Desert, then the power line will have to pass through China. Now, last year, Korea experienced a major blackout. Now, ordinarily, they have sufficient power capability. However, they had lost that in the time of peak demand. So I believe that because we have approached them with this idea, we are already seeing Mongolia, China, Korea, and Japan, which are now in conversation to see whether we could actually make that connection. And so we will not be going after taxpayers' money, but we are trying to see how this can be made a viable idea through the efforts of the private sector. And so this is a project of a very huge scale. So I don't know whether we will be able to go through with this, but I think we should set our goal very high. And so you're saying that you're already embarking in the effort to try to connect these nations. Yes, and that's the reason why we have invited speakers from Mongolia. We also have the mayor of Busan from Korea today, also among us. And when we have the power line between Japan and the other nations, I believe the city of Kitakyushu is probably the closest location to being connected to Asia. And so these are people who harbor these very vast dreams. And so once we start dreaming about this, I think we will be making our every effort to fall in love with this idea and be very enthusiastic about this project, so that the heat that we are feeling in this will also be felt by those around us. Well, Mr. Masuda, we were just talking about such international infrastructure, but in order to make that infrastructure viable, we have to see some changes being made domestically. We will need to see some reform in the power industry, or maybe we'll have to look at liberalization of the market in Japan. Well, as far as the reforms in Japan are concerned, I believe there was a time maybe about 10 years ago where we were looking to deregulating the power industry. However, there was not sufficient discussion at that time. And so this had not brought about any change in the consumer's price for electricity. Well, we are also saying that there is not sufficient transparency in the tariffs or the rates charged for the power distribution. Now we talk about unbundling. Now, power industry is based on bilateral negotiations, so we don't really know the actual cost structure. For example, it seems that the private households end up paying very high rates for electricity, and we have no transparency in the makeup of the cost. Now, what we know in Japan is that we have regional monopolies. Now, rather than the individual monopolies trying to build further thermal power plants, I think what we have to look to is to see how we could provide sufficient power for the peak time. Now, even if it's peak time around here, it may be very cool in Hokkaido so that you don't need any additional power. Now, when we look at the distance between Japan and Korea, it is only about 200 kilometers away, and so that we can have such a connection. Now, I was wondering whether we have a diagram or a picture showing the situation in Europe. Now, I have only shown the submarine cables. It would be too complicated to show the on-land portion. So you can see that there are already 600, 700 kilometers of power line have been connected. And so this is something that we can already do even today, immediately. But what has become an obstacle to this idea is the lack of reform here in Japan. Now we have people, we have representatives from Kitakyushu and Busan here today, because I think these are the two locations where the power lines will probably connecting. So, as we said, we had this discussion about 10 years ago, but now we must shift our view to being more global and more international. And I think we need to have sufficient discussions within Japan to make this possible. So while this may seem like an international issue, this is in actuality an issue for Japan, a domestic issue. Well, Mr. Son? I remember just 10 years ago, or a little over a decade ago, we had the most expensive internet rates of all the industrialized nations. And we also had the slowest internet of the advanced economies. Now, there was a company called, I believe, NTT, which said that ISDN was broadband, and they had defined ISDN as broadband, which was a shock to me. And at that time, NTT had 100% monopoly over telecommunications, and they had the most expensive and the slowest internet service in the world. However, there was a deregulation brought about in the area of telecommunications, and I also appealed to the ministries and also to the Prime Minister. Now, I wasn't really into the telecommunication business at that time. I wasn't even thinking of that. I was in more of the software side and Yahoo. But because I had appealed to the authorities of this, I said that I would be in the telecom business. And I had 100 billion yen deficit over 4 years. However, what happened was that the moment there was competition introduced in Japan, the broadband internet became the cheapest in the world, cheaper than China, cheaper than India, cheaper than Africa. So not just among the advanced economies, we have now the fastest and the most is the least expensive internet in the world. And that's really, that was hindered up to that time by the monopoly. But before we go to Mr. Terashima, let me ask you the situation in Mongolia. What are some of your thoughts, having listened to the discussion right now?
I'm gonna become a fan of this grand project. Actually, the comparison of European integration with this project is not so appropriate. The world has changed for the last 20 years, thanks to this globalization, thanks to this IT technology achievements, thanks to this internet, as Mr. Son said. So therefore, now the speed is becoming more faster. Decision making is becoming more faster. And I think the production of the power is no problem. Mongolia is a powerhouse. And the issue is this grid in technology and financing, and they will be also solved. But the problem is there are two problems in my view. First, there is something to be done in Japan, so we cannot help, such as unbundling, separation of the production, transmission, production, etc. The other big problem, common problem is this, U.S. President Reagan once said, the government is a problem. I would say the governments are problems. So therefore, the biggest hurdle for this project will be the governments. But if we sell the project to these people, to the business, to the consumers, they will make the government to make the right decision at a more fast, speedy way. So therefore, even the internet was a secret U.S. Pentagon project for the military purposes. Now, ultimately, it became the daily everybody's consumption, common product. And the energy is similar to the communication, telecommunication, the similar, even the grid, all these things, it might be even much easier. So therefore, I would encourage Mr. Son not to give up, but expand the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation by bringing the proper representatives from all the countries. I hope next time it will be even not one national, but it will be international foundation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. 寺島さんね、ちょっと私は寺島さんのお考えをぜひ聞きたいと思って。
I'd like to listen to Mr. Terashima's opinion. So, from the global perspective, what is the direction utilities should follow or should take? Otherwise, the Japan cannot become the leader in this innovation. Well, Professor Kashiwagi and myself are the members of the actually Energy Policy Association, or the committee. The nuclear which we are facing at the moment, how we can overcome nuclear issue and to pave the way for the realistic renewable energy sort of era, then the nuclear, or to actually sort of decrease the percentage of nuclear or to phasing out. Probably 9 sort of utilities who are doing the nuclear, before it should be separated and to be the first step is the government is going to integrate the nuclear policy which covers all the 9 utilities nuclear power stations. Then that will inevitably becomes the unbundling. Then if it becomes unbundling, even if we have the 9 utilities, regional utilities, and those utilities to distill wisdom whether too dependent on the renewables or too dependent on the fossil energy, or to take the direction towards internationalization of like a super grid or Asian super grid idea. So the first step is we are really sort of frightening the whole world with this nuclear accident. So we should take the responsibility to really solve this nuclear issue with safety sort of solution. So that's how the government should come up with as the first step. We have 12 more minutes to go, so the second and the third challenges we have been talking about, including the Japanese energy policy, energy sort of the system, especially the unbundling, transparency, integration, unbundling of the transmission and the generation, and the division of the various roles. And do you have any point to add for the internal innovation? OECD members are out of more than 30 countries. And when we had the guests from the world, and I was really enlightened by the experts, out of OECD members, there are only 2 countries which haven't done unbundling of electricity. That is Mexico and Japan. those are the two countries. Who is going to become the last? Is the sort of focus of attention at the moment. China, Korea, European nations, all have already done this unbundling of transmission and generation of electricity. And why Japan cannot do that? Is there any unique reasons, specific reasons? But other countries also, they had the various debate and discussions, and overcoming all those different opinions, they have come to that conclusion. So we can't say Japan is the only unique situation. We can't do unbundling. So I think the most of the such discussions are actually dispatched from the utilities, existing utilities. Mr. Masuda, do you have any additional comment? This March 11 last year, the significance of the great disaster, which we haven't sort of asked and the really sort of approached. And now that we have to come to the roots of this, and so nuclear, and that they used a CO2 reduction, that was the first sort of reason for nuclear. And all those sort of de facto argument and de facto reasons have been accumulated. But now we have to really, once again, revise from the root of the discussion. Yes, please. One point. I came back from America yesterday, the day before yesterday, in American also policy situation. I think we have to face the reality. Like Obama Green New Deal in the States actually attracted a lot of attention, and the solar and biomass, but renewables attraction has been going down in the United States. We have to take some kind of lessons out of that. Because June last year, the subsidy for renewables have been sort of determined, which actually worked as brake for the promotion of renewables. That's mainly because of the financial crisis or in the United States. The renewables, and they try to rely on the FIT as well as the subsidies. And if there is no such sort of things feasible, then the acceleration will be braked. Like in the States, the BTU is $16, and it's go down to $2.5, which is a shale oil. So the energy paradigm has been changing in the United States because of the advent of shale oil. And with that background, I think we should have the economically viable and the market accountable sort of mechanism for renewables. Otherwise, if we actually only rely on the FIT as well as the subsidies, and it doesn't work. So I think this grand vision of this networking and supergrid, I think we should take the responsible sort of the stance for that. Mr. Khan, August 26, that I will commit my whole political life and to really pass the bill for the FIT in Japan, which is going to be in effect this year. But I think that this direction for the renewables would go forward. Probably the deregulation is the first step, or probably the key point, like the agriculture and the healthcare and energy, and probably international sort of viewpoint, it can be used to make the Japanese sort of workings in place. Japan has been so susceptible to outside pressure, in other words, from foreign countries. Well, probably rather than it's a foreign pressure, the globalization, global standard should be referenced to come to the conclusion. That's what I feel. Please. As Mr. Terashima said, that's a very important point. The renewable energy, so it's wonderful, but it's expensive. That's a counter argument. So do you actually give this premium part incurred on the payment of the consumers? That seems to be the regular discussion. And why I'm talking about the Asian supergrid and talking about the Mongolia, because it's abundant solar energy, abundant wind energy. Space is so abundant with very cheap sort of land price, because they are not tapped yet. When we utilize those potentials, and we can actually reduce the cost of power generation, and we don't need any subsidy, or we don't have to dependent on feed-in tariff system. We can actually have the energy which is parity to other energy sources, and which is coming quite not very far in the future, but quite close by. Then, feed-in tariff in domestic market is it's not important. Oh, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Because solar energy equipment was originally developed here, but now that we are sort of dropping out of the race. Japan, to be resurrected or the recovered, like the electricity and more, and the automobiles, and there are quite the shrinking, promising picture of those industries. But I think there should be the industry that we can utilize our technology and our know-hows, and to do that at maximum in Japan, and to really develop the technology and to expand into the bigger scale, and so that we can restore the position, our stance, which we can go abroad. Yes, certainly, internet and energy, fusion of energy, internet, smart grid is certainly very important. Now that we are running out of time, so Mr. Tsaga, and from Mongolia's point of view, do you have any expectation for Japan? What Japan should do? What do you expect Japan to do? And any obstacles that we have to overcome? 1 minute, please. 1 minute.
The resource in broad sense,
Okay, yes.
while Japan has a high tech. And I think the high time has come to position our advantages in various sectors, including the renewable energy. And I want to add, China, Korea, and Japan, all these countries are need in import in energy. So therefore also this demand is also conducive. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very appreciated. それではね、寺島さん。
So now, Mr. Terashima, for the recovery of the disaster-stricken area, this networking and also this smart grid and so on, any message? I'm also associated with the how to do the energy project in this disaster area, like in conjunction with the mega solar sort of project. And also the bio is another aspect that we actually sort of have some expectation, like radiation inflicted area and also salt in the seawater inflicted area, that we can grow some of the plants and vegetables which we don't consume, but we can actually need a lot of wisdom. And in 1970s, the Aaron Robinson's soft energy path, and that was the time that I started getting interested in and associated with this. And this project is now facing the very critical timing. Mr. Son, please. And then, Mr. Masuda. Last week, I visited Minamisoma City, and the mayor of the Minamisoma City said, and we actually sort of drove around the debris and the piles of debris of the tsunami, and he was saying, and that we are talking about how much cost, how many years do we need to turn this back into the agricultural land. Even if we succeed that, how much we can actually, well, how much would it be? Because when we have this sort of negative brand of Fukushima, it's very difficult to sell agricultural products or even the manufactured goods, because the people are so worried about the radiation associated with Fukushima. But they can't change this brand. So we would like to have the products made in Fukushima, for example, to have a lot of panels which can be transformed into electricity. Then people don't worry about the electricity made in Fukushima. So he was saying, please install all the panels here. So we shook hands, and I said, hooray to Fukushima. Thank you very much. Mr. Masuda, because you used to be the mayor, governor of Iwate Prefecture, so you must have a lot of emotional attachment. Yes, this time the 150 countries throughout the world supported us in the disaster area. We should never forget this gratitude. And so including those people all over the world in the process of recovery, we want to repay the debt of gratitude to those people. And now we have the marginalized area, less population, disaster-stricken area, and we have to have this sort of pioneer in making the recovery in disaster done in Minami Soma City, how to overcome energy. There are so many other ways that we can repay the debt of gratitude. For example, well, we have the Kitakyushu City Mayor here, but the Minami Soma City, and also we have the New Steel, Japan New Steel. They have the land. So we can actually start deregulation of the electricity market. We can have the special economic zone for the free sort of market or deregulated market for electricity. Of course, we can actually make the disaster area to be the pioneering area for innovative ideas. So I think the alleviating regulation a little bit, small-scale deregulation can make so many things possible. So it is, in other words, a global experiment can be done in the disaster area. Thank you very much. We actually shortened or sort of compacted or concised the 2 hours worth of discussion into 1 hour, and we were able to get so much ideas. And energy security we talk about. When security talk about, the definition of security is to offer the things necessary with the equivalent cost or the optimal cost. How much sort of infrastructure will be laid, and how much renewable energy can be based on that. And also the fruits out of this system is, of course, that requires the electricity market liberalization. Deregulation will actually contribute to the growth economic models. So this actually issue or the challenge has a lot of sort of impact. And thank you very much for the very fruitful discussion and the inspiration. Thank you for all the panelists.
第一部の皆様、
Thank you very much for participating in the first session. We would like to change the stage and have the second set of panelists come up to the floor. So we are very grateful for the first session and the panelists who participated.
それでは第
Then the panelists for the second session, please do come up to the stage. Please welcome the panelists with a warm round of applause.
それでは新しいご登壇者の皆様をお迎え
Let us start the second part of this session.
それでは引き続き
Then continuing on, I would like to serve as the MC. My name is Kashiwagi, and the theme is the same as the first session. That is to say, the transmission grid for the renewables, how to expand that into Asia, or what is happening in other countries in the area of renewables transmission. So I hope that the panelists will share with us the wisdom that they have. We have here with us on the stage, and I would like the two speakers to make their presentation in about 10 minutes, and then ultimately we'll have discussion. So a little bit different from the first half. First, I'd like to call upon Dr. Thiemo Grop, Director of Desertec, and there will be cooperation with JREF, and Dr. Grop is from the Desertec Foundation. So what is Desertec doing? What is the sort of the super grid concept that they have for Asia? And after that, I would like to call upon Mr. Byamba Saikan, who is the CEO of Newcom Mongolia, and he would be touching upon the enormous amount of resources, renewable resources in Mongolia, as previously the advisor to the president, Mr. Batsam, mentioned. So in the company called Newcom, he's involved in commercializing the various renewable resources available. And after that, Mr. Son will be picking up on the subject and talking about how JREF is approaching this area. And I'm sure Mr. Son would have a very great message to tell us. And then with Professor Yamaji and myself, we'll try to summarize the ongoing discussion. So, first, may I call upon Dr. Thiemo Grop.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Son, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure and an honor for us to be here at this event. And even more, it's a pleasure for us and an honor to have signed an MOU and collaboration agreement with JREF. And it's also good to see for us as an NGO and as a foundation that is rather young but has a long history, so to speak, to see how renewable energy in this room is already building bridges between peoples and nations. And this is something, I think that's the most important outcome for me in the last 2 days here, that this has the potential to actually overcome a lot of hurdles that we still have in the world. Now, we would start with a video message of Gerhard Knies. Gerhard Knies, he's kind of the spiritual father of Desertec, and he founded, or he started this idea in '86, right after Chernobyl happened, so about 25 years ago. And Gerhard Knies is turning 75 this year. He's a researcher. He has been a researcher in a German research institute, and he has been fighting for more than 20 years for this idea against all barriers, and it has been quite difficult for him for many years. And he's also a stubborn guy, and that's basically the main reason why Desertec is alive today, and so let's say in everybody's mouth. So Desertec has been driven by him and many others over many years, and I think that's also one of the messages that I would like to put in to the discussion today, big ideas and, let's say, revolutions are always driven by people, inspired people who like to convince others. And sometimes it's a long way to go, but I think it's worth. And I would like to call the video message of Gerhard Knies now.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with extending my congratulations to the Japanese Renewable Energy Foundation for running this very important event, Revision 2012. As you know, right now we are living with about 7 billion people on this planet, and we are overusing its carrying capacity already. Now we are moving to 10 billion people, and that would mean that if we have 10 billion people, we would need about 3 Earths to provide the living conditions for those 10 billion people. This cannot work. Since we are having only one, we have to do something about it. The deserts are a tremendous resource for clean energy. The desert receives in 6 hours as much energy from the sun as humankind right now is using in a full year. But it is important and necessary that the power from deserts is then transmitted to where people are living. And this is possible because of the high voltage direct current transmission technology, which has only 3% losses of about 1,000 kilometers. The Desertec Foundation has studied in detail how to use the energy of North African deserts for supplying Europe with clean power. To this end, we have designed a supergrid structure from North Africa to Europe, and that includes all the renewable energy resources in Europe and in North Africa. And the result is that clean power can be delivered to all European countries and to all North African countries in a way that no coal power plants and no nuclear power plants no longer are necessary. In about 40 years from now, we can have a smooth transition by which we replace completely nuclear and fossil power by clean power. The Desertec Foundation will be very happy to support this effort of JRF, and to this end, I hope we will sign today a memorandum of understanding that the two foundations will cooperate on these issues.
Yeah, I will go through the first slides a little bit faster since Gerhard has already summarized the main points. Maybe one small remark. Desertec might be known to you from a slightly different perspective as I tell it today, but I will come to, let's say, the more industrial part of the story later in my talk. Starting with the background of the whole story, you know all that. I think if you look at that curve, how the population develops over the last years, has been developed over the last years, this is quite a sign that we run into, let's say, some real challenges. Combining this with the question of climate change, and I think that's an important side restriction. You always have to keep in mind, of course, using up the fossil fuels is like using up your savings is one thing. It drives, on the long run, you run out of fossil fuels, it drives up the price, and by the end of the day, renewables get competitive. But climate change gives some sort of side condition that urges us to move faster than we would have to do just by following the market. And I think that's an important notion, and depending on the model that you believe in, we have to react quite fast within the next, let's say, 20 to 30 years. Of course, Desertec deals not only with energy. Energy is the central issue, but it deals with many other resources and socio-economic questions that are closely related with the issue of energy. And one of the most important ones is the availability of drinking water. that has a lot of other implications, and one of the important ones that we see in the Yamina region is migration. This is the border between Morocco and Spain. Northern part of Morocco, there's a little piece of Spain, and so we can lively see what challenges we will face. Now, 86, I already mentioned, was kind of the starting point of Desertec after the nuclear accident in Chernobyl. At that time, it was not called Desertec, and it was developed over many years with people from all over Europe and around the Mediterranean. So it's a concept that has already spanned nations and cultures. People from Jordan, from Egypt, from Algeria, from Morocco, from Germany, and other countries were involved in that, and basically due to this nuclear accident. And it was a very sad and event that 25 years later we had to be reminded once more that we still have to solve a couple of urgent issues around energy and energy security. Now, we are very happy that now this fantastic movement started here in Japan, because the big question is, summing up all of those challenges, are we able and are we willing to find solutions? Because solutions are probably there. And this can be summarized in a very simple picture, because we always talk about simple pictures. Gerhard Knies had shown that already. If you look at those 7 to 8, 9 and more billion people, we'll need 3 planets in 20 to 40 years from now. And how can we turn that into 1 planet? That's the big question. And I think that's the key thing. If we have a discussion about how competitive are renewables, we also have to have a discussion about what is the future of our kids and their kids and so on. And what do we externalize by the way of living today into further future generations. And I think that's one of the important aspects that have to be addressed when talking about costs. Now, the technologies are available. I think this has been mentioned the last 2 days several times. Of course, some of them are in early stage, others are more mature, but we think basically technological basis is there to already significantly start the transition into the renewable age. And some of them might be, let's say, early industrial phase, like car industry in the 20s, but we already know that we need 4 wheels and an engine and steering wheel and so on. So it's basically no nuclear fusion has to be invented in order to do the transition. I think that's an important message. Second message, it has also been mentioned several times, renewable energy is highly abundant. And that's basically the sign and the symbol of Desertec Foundation. Desertec, the little red square, it basically shows the irradiation in this little square, and you could put it maybe also to Mongolia, is the primary energy use of mankind. Of course, not taking into account efficiencies and so on, but it simply shows renewable energy is highly abundant. And if you can use the space in the deserts partially in combination with other resources, then this might be a fantastic opportunity to cover our needs with regard to energy use. Now, if you look at the complete area of deserts in the world, and you take the irradiation in this area, and you compare it with the resources and reserves with regard to fossil and nuclear resources, then we have about 40 weeks of sun compared to that. So this once again shows how abundant the sun and all the other renewables are available on this planet. Now, you have seen that in a picture of Gerhard Knies right now. I have to add maybe to this picture. This is a scenario. It basically shows the feasibility of how Desertec can be realized, and how a mixture of different renewables in combination with a super grid, with a smart grid, can come into reality. And important to mention is it's not only solar thermal in the deserts, it's wind, it's hydro, it's biomass, it's geothermal and so on. So it's a combination of different renewables, and it's a combination of global and local, of centralized and decentralized solutions. So I would say no decentralized approach is in contrary to Desertec. In the other way around, I would say Desertec and the decentralized approaches are complementary to each other. That's important to mention, and very often this is kind of mixed up. Now, another important feature is, what do we do at night when the wind is not blowing? We need some, let's say, dispatchability or storage capacity with regard to the power. And that's one aspect of solar thermal energy. They have heat storage tanks in their power plants that can provide electricity basically day and night. And that's an important feature. If we want to replace gas-fired plants and others on the long run, we have to have also dispatchable power. And that's maybe 10, 15, whatever % of the overall capacity. So we are not talking about having 100% in the deserts, but a mixture of different solutions depending on the local conditions. Now, summing this all up, Desertec is not just a concept about energy, it's a concept about energy, climate security, it's a concept about water, socioeconomic development, local value generation and creation, political security, and last but not least about peace. And I think that's also the basis of this transition. The basis of the transition has to be in the civil society. People have to be aware of it and be behind it, so then politics can act and industry as well. It's a combination of all the renewable sources depending on the local situation. And of course, at the end of the day, we have to have a secure and a stable situation, so we need power day and night, and this is why we have to talk about grids and we have to talk about storage, and that's, I think, one of the key things. Now, Desertec Foundation is a civil society founded entity together with the Club of Rome. It has been founded about 3 years ago, but the idea has been around for, I would say, more than 20 years. You might know a lot about Desertec from the industrial initiative. Luckily, we could found this initiative about 3 years ago. Together with Munich Re, this industrial initiative was founded in order to pave the way for Desertec in the Yumina region. In addition, we also founded a university network. It started actually in Tunisia, so you can already see the international approach with regard to Desertec. DRI is meanwhile more than 50 companies, and they are kind of creating markets in the Yumina region in order to realize those projects. Now, in addition, we do, as a foundation, we do NGO projects like human capacity building and know-how transfer between different countries. Here, one example with Morocco. Morocco is one of the leading countries in North Africa with regard to renewables. They also have their own solar plan, like Tunisia. So they are quite confident about that this can also be a very positive development for the future of the country. Then we also started to evaluate projects and see, okay, it's good to have a nice concept, but it has to be real and credible. In order to kind of evaluate that, we have set up a catalog of criteria going from the provision and the creation of energy over social factors and environmental factors. So that's more kind of an NGO evaluation of a project, and we did that for first project called Tunur. It's about roughly 2 gigawatt in Tunisia with export to Italy and Europe. And we announced that about 2 months ago in Frankfurt and in Tunis. Was a big success, and the group in Tunisia is currently speaking to all government levels, and they are quite optimistic that the project might get started not too long from now. Now, closing up with the global approach and also the region here. I think It doesn't make sense, and I think that was also quite clear in the last 2 days. It doesn't make sense to look only for national solutions on the long run, because climate change doesn't care about national solutions. So we need nation-bridging solutions, we need international solutions, and desert tech is a global concept as well. Here you can see just roughly how in the different areas you could combine local production with renewables, with desert production. And what we have experienced in this region here is already 3 years ago, I was in talks with, for example, the Korean Minister of Environment with an initiative from Korea called Gobi-Tech. We are in discussion with China, an initiative from the Chinese Science Academy of Sciences, under patronage of the Chinese Minister for Science, with 67 organizations in China to promote CSP projects in China. We are in discussions with Japan, and we're very happy about this collaboration here. So we think in the region there's a lot going on, and of course there are political issues in a similar way as we have them in North Africa and partially in Europe. But I think renewable energy gives a chance to overcome many of those issues, facing the challenge that we all have together in front of us. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we should join forces and work together. And in this respect, I am once again very happy to be here and to do this collaboration with JREF. Thank you very much.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Energy, safe water, climate. So we do live in a borderless world, and we have to expand the network that we can utilize. And through that, the CO2 emissions could be reduced. And I think the Desert Tech Foundation or the Desert Tech concept have latched on to a very wonderful, I think, idea. Thank you very much, Dr. Gropp. And continuing on.
So we'd like to invite Mr. Ben Basarkan. Is that the right pronunciation? Please start your presentation. And as was introduced, he is the CEO of Newcon Group. Please.
Presentation, please.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I'm very happy to be invited here today and to be speaking about, again, Mongolia's precious resource, which is renewable energy. And I guess marshalling Mongolian wind, the reason this title I thought would be appropriate is a few weeks ago there was an article in the New York Times talking about basically Mongolia's renewable energy potential, and the title was Marshalling the Winds of Mongolia. So I think it's a good title. And this picture comes from a request of Mr. Tsaran, and he yesterday talked about again, all Mongolian families, particularly the nomads, having to have this solar panels and dishes to watch TV. And so he asked me to show a photo. So here it is. And well, this is, I can call this a lazy nomad. And this guy is speaking on a cell phone, and probably he's, again, checking out the prices on the market, but instead of going to the market himself, he's using his cell phone. And again, Mr. Tsaran said about camels carrying the solar panels. I couldn't find any photos, but I did find this one. And this is a very good kind of photo that shows the technology and what technology brings to in changing people's lives. And our company introduced cell phones first to Mongolia 16 years ago. And this is the result. And so again, we pride ourselves with bridging distances and connecting people And I think the topic that we are talking here today, the Asia supergrid, is exactly related to that. And this slide basically talks about the growth in the Mongolian economy. And I think Mr. Tsaran, during his presentation, said that the economy is growing at a very high rate. And last year, the growth was 17%. And just to give you some data, restaurant revenues last year grew by 800% in Mongolia. Construction material industry grew by 400%. So the economy is really taking off. And a lot of it, unfortunately, has to do with, again, the resources underneath the ground. And then if you would ask me what Mongolia's competitive advantage today, what is one thing that Mongolia has that others don't, and I think we had this discussion this morning with Mr. Son as well, is we have lots of land. We have 1.6 million square kilometers of land and only 3 million people. And that means we can build lots of wind farms and lots of solar farms in Mongolia. And again, we want to grow the economy. And one way to grow the economy is, again, by investing more into the clean energy. And this, again, I showed this slide in Hong Kong a few months ago, and then there was an article in Bloomberg saying, well, Mongolia's renewable energy supply is belittling world's nuclear supply. That's a good one, and I like it. And we talked about the various potentials that, again, the Gobi Desert has in terms of solar and also the wind. And again, this, don't ask me how this was calculated, because our guys have done it. But again, this is based on research that has already been done, 2.6 terawatts, and that's a large capacity. And it's a technical resource that the country has. And 300 days of sun, and that's what also Mongolia has competitively better than most of the countries, 300 days of sun. Okay, I guess another thing about the Mongolian economic growth when you talk about it today, and for those of you who do follow Mongolia, Mongolia is on the world map a lot for its mineral resources, particularly its coal resources. And we are, last year, Mongolia has surpassed Australia, for example, with its coal exports. So we export more coal to China than Australia does. And Mongolia, another thing that Mongolia is good at, and for those of you who live here, I guess we produce very good sumo wrestlers. And again, in my childhood, before again, my dream of becoming a clean energy champion, I was actually dreaming to become a sumo champion. But obviously, my father made an end to it. Again, every time I would go to my dad and say, "Dad, no, I'm so good. I'm kicking those guys' butts," and then he would go, "My son, go do your homework." So he killed my dream. But again, sumo wrestling is a big culture in Mongolia, and in Japan, I guess, again, we have lots of sumo wrestlers from Mongolia as well. And recently, Newcom has participated in the Mongolia Economic Forum. And what Mongolia Economic Forum is, it's a platform very much to Davos, similar to what Davos does, the World Economic Forum, right? And it's a gathering of Mongolia's business leaders, government leaders, again, leaders from the NGO, leading scientists, and it's a platform to talk about development and what Mongolian economy would be doing in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, to make us more competitive and sustainable. And this year, one of the topics that was discussed the most was, again, Mongolia can become the clean energy champion of the region of Asia. And Mr. Tsaran has coined a phrase called the energy heaven. Mongolia has lots of energy resources, both underneath the ground and on the ground, on the land. So again, we are an energy heaven, and I think that message resonated throughout the Economic Forum. And I was the vice chair this year, and we had lots of interesting discussions. One of them was a panel or it was a debate actually on the topic called, is it coal or is it wind? And we had basically leaders from then political parties. This gentleman is he's a deputy mayor of the city, and he's one of the leaders of the Democratic Party. This gentleman is the Minister of Energy, and it's me. This guy runs a think tank, a competitiveness research center. So we sat and debated on what Mongolia can bring into its economic model, and whether, again, renewable energy would be part of it. And at the end, convincingly, again, renewable energy won. So that was a very good kind of exercise, and this platform was used well. So again, transforming Mongolia into an Asian energy leader in the next 10 years, that was a message that came out of this Mongolia Economic Forum. Okay, well, some of you may have seen this map, and again, before we met Mr. Song, again, this was our dream, 20 gigawatts of wind farms in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. But now I think the potential is much more than that. And when the Asia supergrid becomes technically operational, I think we would be ready with supplying, again, more wind and solar energy into this mix. We are also building the country's first wind farm. And this has been a journey, I would describe. And I joined the company about 2 years back. Again, this Selkit project started off about 8 years ago. And previously, I used to work with the Asian Development Bank. And when I was dealing with, the Central Asian Regional Economic Forum, called CAREC, and we had lots of issues on energy markets and energy integration. Again, the Mongolian government representatives always came and said, okay, we are building the country's first wind farm, and there is a private sector that is building it, and it would be operational in 2009. But today, it's 2012, and I'm ironically in charge of building that wind farm. So again, it just shows that there are lots of challenges in starting off, particularly being the first one in the market. And my friend Steve Sawyer was in Mongolia last year, and he went to the site, and this Windy Mountain, right? And it's a site called Windy Mountain. Selkit in Mongolian means Windy Mountain. And I think he would tell you that it's probably a very good wind condition at this site. And the first time I went to the site was, again, a couple of years back before I took over my new job. And it was a very hot summer day, no winds at all. So I drove to the site, I get out of the car, and it was no wind. So I'm like, oh, it's going to be a challenge. But as soon as I walked up the mountain, maybe it was a couple of minutes walking upwards, and then I saw, okay, this is good. The wind was blowing. And we always get this. Whenever, again, we have experts coming in to visit the site, and I saw a technician or an engineer from Siemens one day. It was actually March last year where he went to check the site, and it was still very cold back then, but when he got out of the car, he said, where's the wind? And he walked up again, a few steps. 3 minutes later, he said, okay, I'm convinced. I want to go back into my car. I'm freezing. So the construction we have started in June of last year, because again we need to build the access roads. The transmission line has been built now, and all we are waiting now is whether to essentially warm up so that we can start the installation of the turbines. And it's been a very interesting experience for us, because we had essentially competition in the selection of turbines, and we had, again, we ended up choosing GE's 1.6 megawatt turbines, again, because they were technically the most appropriate turbine for the site. But again, there was a very interesting competition that had the European suppliers, Korean suppliers, Japanese suppliers competing for this project. So. And now we've signed all the contracts last year, and we're in the process of just, again, completing the commissioning. And we're, November of this year is our target date, and this will be Mongolia's first large-scale wind farm, 50 megawatts. I think in terms of a size of a project, it's a very reasonable project. It's costing us more than, again, it would in the States or in China because of infrastructure problems. But again, we knew this from the beginning. So 50 megawatt project is costing us $120 million to build. And we have a renewable energy law in Mongolia today, which allows us, again, as Mr. Tsaran said, to use feed-in tariffs. So that the tariffs have been set at 9.5 cents. Do I like it? Not exactly. I would ask for more, but we still have basically a legal and regulatory environment that allows us to invest. I think this is also an important aspect with renewable energy, particularly when you have trying to use policies to attract investment. Again, if you wait for stars to align, it's going to take a long time, right? So I think it's actually we lead by, again, making sure that the stars are aligning in front of us. And this is a good project and good example. Again, this is going to be the first power plant to be built and connected to the national grid since 1986. And when we talked about Mongolia's growth, again, it's being basically in double digits, and probably it will be in the next 10, 15 years. Again, we will need more wind farms like this. And obviously our dream is not only to supply Mongolia, but also the region. But again, here's what a 50 megawatt wind farm does to an economy like Mongolia. Again, we're going to be basically using 200,000 tons less coal, burning less coal, and then 160,000 tons, and then this is CO2 emissions. And obviously, again, we also have a very scarce resource called water, and we'll be saving lots of water. So again, this is a very good project, and we are very happy that, again, we will be commissioning it this year. But I think this will, again, attract more people to invest into Mongolia's wind. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time, so just a few, again, this is just a few slides that talks about my company. Again, we first introduced cell phones to the country, and because of that, we have lazy nomads now. But the cell phone industry, or the mobile telephone industry, is the most competitive industry in Mongolia today. And this was evident with the Economic Competitiveness Center does Mongolia's competitiveness report, and it compares Mongolia in various industries and infrastructures against 14 other economies. And we always score very high on telecoms and IT. And I think the main reason is because the private sector has been allowed into this, and there is healthy competition. And our energy sector, again, Mr. Tsaran said, unbundling has been done 10 years ago, but still, we are the first people to start investing into this sector. And again, more basically investment needs to happen, essentially breaking off the state monopoly. But again, once the private sector comes in, things change, and our lives change. And I think today we champion those things in Mongolia, but we also, again, my life has changed since, again, Mongolia started using cell phones. And I think all of the people who live in Mongolia today also do that. Yeah. So again, thank you very much, and this has been a very interesting platform. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
どうもありがとう。
Thank you very much.
エネルギー。
Thank you very much. There is so much abundant natural resources in your country, and Mongolia will become the supplier for energy and resources for the whole of Asia. The question is, how can we really commercialize those resources in Mongolia? And that's up to the other countries of Asia. So lastly, I'd like to call upon Mr. Masayoshi Son, founder and chairperson of JREF, to make the final presentation. So we are a little behind time, but I hope that you will tolerate a shorter break.
本当に
Thank you very much for bearing with us for a very long time. We've been able to hear such wonderful stories and presentations from the two speakers and the others as well. And I think the key word that we've been listening to is the Asian supergrid. Can we make this supergrid for Asia? And of course, we know full well that we must start generating electricity from renewables, and the people of Japan have already started discussing this question, and with that has to be provided to the people of Japan at the lowest possible price and in the most abundant way. So most people criticize renewables for being too expensive, or that there's not enough renewables in Japan. But I think on these two, I think we do have in front of us a solution. And I think the way to resolve the problem is to have an Asian supergrid. And after I thought up of this idea, I was looking for other examples. So Europe, the Europeans have linked their grid to each other. And so if the Europeans can do it, the Asians can do it. So there was the vision of idealists in Europe who wanted to link the grid to each other. And then I got in touch with the Desertec in Europe to find out how they were able to interconnect. Was it 2 weeks ago? I got visitors from Desertec, and we shook hands very firmly, if I may say so. And so Desertec had made research and development into various areas, and we learned quite a lot from Desertec. And on our side too, I think we have to carry out our research concerning what is possible for Asia. And I think we can cooperate with each other, Desertec and ourselves. And so therefore a memorandum of understanding was signed between the two organizations for the purpose of further research and cooperation. And not only ourselves, so we know that there are other parties who are interested, who want to join in the discussion. And I think there is this accumulated wisdom that we can rely upon. For example, the king and queen of Bhutan visited Japan quite recently, a very young couple, very beautiful couple, and Bhutan generates at 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Japan, it's 20 cents. That's 10 times. So it's about 16 yen in Japanese yen terms. But and for the general consumer, that you have to pay 24 yen. And then what TEPCO is saying is that there will be a 10% price hike on top of this. And versus that, we don't have a veto. So if you don't want that price hike, there's not going to be any electricity for your house from tomorrow. Thus, I think what we need is there is a country called Bhutan who is able to generate electricity at 2 cents kWh based upon its hydro. And isn't it possible to utilize that? Or perhaps maybe from Bhutan there could be exports to India. And so if the whole of Asia is covered with a supergrid, then we could Bhutan could export its electricity to Japan or to other countries. The production cost of electricity in Bhutan is only 2 cents. So at the speed of light, it can go around the world in 7.5 times or so. So therefore, the distance is not a problem for electricity. And for Japan too. Maybe we would have more renewables, more photovoltaics in Japan, and perhaps in the not-too-distant future, Japan may be able to export its electricity based upon PV, geothermal, or whatever. So there are 3 points to this Asian super grid. It should provide stable electricity supply. Just until a year ago, I had thought that nuclear was stable, safe, and cheap. So I thought that it was perfect. It was characterized by these virtues that I believed in. But for all of these 3, I think I was wrong. So, and I think for the people of Japan too, you are questioning this nuclear power. Is it really stable, safe, and inexpensive? So I think we are all questioning whether or not nuclear power is it really stable? Is it really inexpensive? I think we know for sure that it is no longer safe. But concerning renewables, I think the question becomes, we know that it's stable. It can provide us with the electricity. The question becomes, is renewables really inexpensive? But I think the more we invest in renewables, the more inexpensive it will become, and particularly if there is a super grid to connect the grid in each country. So let's look at wind power generation. And of course, there'll be variation. And PV, depending on the weather for that day, there could be variation in the amount of power generated, and depending on whether the sun is out or whether we are talking about the night. But if the greater, the more expansive the grid is, then we could smooth out, level out the ups and downs. So right now in Japan today, maybe there is excess power. However, there is no technology to store a large amount of power. But so if there is some country or some region in the world that has an excess of electricity, that should be sent at the speed of light to somewhere else around the world. So that is one way to stabilize, I believe, the power supply. And also some countries can generate electricity quite inexpensively. Bhutan at 2 cents. Or for example, Tokyo 0.2. And also Japan the Japanese are paying 24 yen. So it's about 30 cents or so that the ordinary consumer is paying for his electricity. And there will be a 10% hike very soon. So Tokyo, or the people in Tokyo, or people in Japan would have to pay the highest electricity price in Asia. So this is the greatest vulnerability of Japan. But then the reverse side of this, the other side of coin is that, so if there was a super grid connecting Japan with the rest of Asia, then we will benefit. Japan will be the greatest beneficiary of the Asian super grid. So maybe some companies are saying, who are belonging to the Keidan, saying that they'll have to move their factories and plants overseas because of this very high electricity price. Then, if they can be supplied with a very inexpensive electricity based upon the Asian super grid, that Japanese plant or factory would not have to move overseas. So, and furthermore, Japan is suffering from a shortage, a dearth of electricity. So the greatest beneficiary of the Asian super grid would be Japan. And those other countries who are linked, interconnected with the Asian supergrid could supply Japan with electricity, and Japan would become the greatest purchaser of the Asian supergrid. So therefore, if you have a buyer and a seller, then you have business there, you have a market there. So if you find a customer, if you find a purchaser for your product, then we can start the business. Within Asia, Japan is paying the highest electricity price, and Japan suffers from a shortage of electricity. Then we can say to the other countries of Asia, we don't have enough electricity, we'll buy from you. So this is the way in which Japan can contribute to the creation of the Asian supergrid, and in a way, because of those shortages, Japan to take the leadership. And so by the lowering of the electricity price in Japan, Japan becomes the beneficiary. And furthermore, the other countries of Asia are generating electricity at a low price, so therefore Japan becomes an export market. So this is a win-win solution. If there is a win-win equation, then I think we can attain the understanding and encouragement of the people, then we can move forward. If it's a zero-sum game, if someone wins, someone loses, I don't think that this project is viable. However, this is a win-win situation. So I think for sure, maybe we can only move slowly, and some government quite near us can only move at snail's pace. But I think the citizens, the users of electricity will understand, the consumers will understand, our neighbors, our neighboring countries will understand the situation. Maybe it might take 10 years, 20 years, but I think this is a solution for the next century. If this is a solution for the next 10 or 20 years, then you can utilize the thermal power plant that's near you, or we can restart the nuclear power plants. But of course, I'm opposed to that idea. But that could be an option. I'm opposed to it. But in either case, we must not allow, and I think it's going to be extremely difficult to construct a new nuclear power plant. And I think we should not restart a nuclear power plant that is already 40 years old. And so let's say 20 years from now, I don't think there would be any nuclear power plants operating in the future, let's say 20 years from now. So it's a problem of time. Just wait. There will be no more nuclear power plants. I mean, some of you may like nuclear power plants, and there may be proponents of nuclear power, but it's a matter of time. They will all disappear. So, of course, I'm opposed to the idea of restarting the nuclear power plants. But in any case, there is a shortage of electricity, and we cannot leave the situation as is. So, in the next 10 or 20 years, perhaps we might have to depend on the thermal power plants available in this country. And right now, there's only 2 nuclear power plants working. There used to be 54 operating. It's just now 2. So some people are saying that that will stop the whole of the economic activities in Japan, or all of the Japanese household will suffer from a blackout. But that has not happened. And only 2 nuclear power plants are operating right now. And I think the people of Japan have made their efforts to conserve the amount of electricity consumed. And the operation of the thermal power plants have increased. But in the next 10, 20 years, of course, we have to make efforts. We have to make sacrifices, and there might be other things that we have to do. But you know that the fuel for the thermal power plants is on the increase. Crude oil prices are rising. So if we look towards the next 100 years to the next century, I think this is the only answer available. And so if you are in a quandary, you have to look at the horizon. If you look at the horizon, and if you see the answer, and you have to run towards that answer without looking towards the left or looking towards the right. You have to go straight forward. And if you do go towards the side roads, that's a short-term answer to your problem. So this is an economic answer also to the problem that we face right now. So without any burden to the Japanese populace, without any public money, taxpayers' money, this is the answer to the problems that Japan faces. And we are talking, of course, about the feed-in tariff and the other subsidies for renewables. But in the mid to long term, I think this is the answer, and it will mean that renewables would be much more inexpensive than nuclear power plants, and also the thermal power generation, and also the safety would be much higher. And of course, for the general public, the safety hurdle or the safety standard for the power plants have been raised by the fiasco the Fukushima fiasco we experienced. So this will be the answer for the next 100 or even 1,000 years. So this is an ecosystem, and also it is possible to level the load, shift or shave the load for the grid. So if we look at the problem from the bird's eye view, then if we have this Asian supergrid, it'll be very easy to shave off the peak portion. So we're not talking about whether it rains or not, whether the wind is blowing or not. So there will be time lags, differences in time zones. And as was mentioned with Desert Tech, there will be the linkage between Africa and Europe. So I hope that that Desert Tech will link up with India as well. And I hope that we can reach India as well. So, and maybe we can shake hands in India when the Desert Tech and our Asian supergrid will be linked there. Then it would mean that the whole of the Eurasian continent, which means that when Japan is during the day, it will mean that the European countries are in their nighttime. So therefore, it will be able to utilize the differences in the natural time differences, the time zones. So there is no need for any batteries, gigantic batteries. So, and these gigantic batteries are so expensive. So it would be much easier and more inexpensive to just link the grids between the north and between the southern countries too. There are differences in seasons as well. So that would be one more way to level the load as well, rather than looking into smaller batteries that could be used in the households or buildings. Maybe that would be a good idea for the local problems. For the they could serve as the local buffer. But if we look at the problem from the global perspective, then rather than having these gigantic batteries, which are extremely expensive, it's better, more effective to have the interconnection of the grids, a global grid. So that is my idea for the Asian supergrid, and I would like to implement this structure.
So, with this interest, there were three questions that we had to consider. National security issue. So, what will be the case if there was disconnection? If we were dependent on Mongolia, for example, for electricity, and if the line was disconnected in between, what would happen? People will need to worry about the national security issue and also practicability of the international undersea cable, ability to supply electricity. And now, let's look at national security issue first. So, is it really possible to interchange electricity between countries? But in Japan, how much self-sufficiency do we have within Japan? So, 90% plus. This energy is through imports of resources. So to start off with, Japan is not self-sufficient in terms of electricity. I don't know the precise number, but close to 90%. We are dependent in terms of resources. So whether it's a tank or a pipeline, whether it's going to be a transmission line, that would be an issue. But if we can have diversification of transportation, not be dependent on one mode, but if we can have diversification of transportation, we'll be able to have greater security. It's not that we're trying to bring 100% of the electricity through grid. We need to be diverse. That would be safest. And also the grid, it could be via China, or it could be via Korea. Don't be dependent on just one route, but if it's, for example, from Mongolia, it could be via Russia. That's one possibility. And as we have seen in the supergrid drawing, and internet as well, it has different routes. That's why if there's a disconnect one place, it's strong, because even with earthquakes and catastrophes, it can overcome the issue because it is very diverse. And that's why we want the grid. And also, what is the practicability of an international undersea cable, submarine cable? People may think that what would happen if sharks eat up the line. And some people say it's very expensive. But in Europe, as has been shown, there's a lot of submarine cables. And we have a lot of telecommunication cables connecting different parts of the world already. So we have these IT cables functioning well. Why is it that there is a problem with undersea cables for electricity? And we see a wonderful performance in Europe, and there are many new projects ongoing as well, additional projects per se. And Desert Tech has a large concept, and they're trying to promote this even further. So the Desert Tech concept is moving forward very steadily. And in Europe, which company it has the largest performance regarding undersea cables? It was ABB. So I asked my people, please call someone from ABB to come over. Please give us a quote immediately. And then they gave us a quote, and I found out that, oh, it's not that expensive. I thought, then we can go ahead with this. It will last for 40 years. If you divide by 40 years, it's quite cheap. Oh, I thought, oh, this much. I can solve this problem myself. So 1 trillion yen of investment is given in 2 years' time. So that's what the SoftBank company invests in for telecommunication. And there are a lot of complaints about how the connection is with SoftBank, and we're working very hard to have better connection. And we're spending 1 trillion yen every 2 years. Considering that, as has been mentioned, with Busan and Kitakyushu, it's only 200 kilometers away. Only 200 kilometers. So you'll be able to connect with 10 billion yen or so. So my sign would give a go sign. So after getting the quote, I found it surprisingly inexpensive. So I think this is not just a dream. I was able to really feel that. Now, with all this, I think it's quite feasible. So let's say in China, they say that they have electricity shortage, and we may not be able to be dependent on China. But we have India that will be growing in the future. So it may be that we cannot overly depend on Asia alone. But as has been mentioned several times, we have the Gobi Desert. Just with that area alone, they can cover, just with wind, 8 times, and 4 times with solar, the amount of electricity that we need in Japan. So we have abundant amount, 2 terawatts worth. So in nuclear power plants, it's equivalent to 2,000 plants. So we have 54 plants in Japan. So we can have abundant amount of electricity, and nuclear power can provide a lot of power generation. And there were people who were saying that renewable energy cannot. They were saying that because they were ignorant. They didn't know what was available. So when you really think renewable energy is really abundant. It's in surplus. And you have the sunshine, and the following day you'll be able to use the energy that the sunshine had given us. But we have not been using that. We've been wasting that. The energy of the wind that is blowing today has not been stored for tomorrow. We've been totally wasting the wind. We had an overabundance, but we have not used it. So we should use it right away. And we're blowing and sun shining 100 years, 1,000 years. So renewable energy is no problem of shortage. That's really a misunderstanding. So as has been discussed, there is an overabundance of potential. Now, the next thing is how we can make use of it. So let's make use of it. So this dream, maybe some thought it was a dream in the Asia Supergrid. It was last year, September, when we had this similar meeting. I said, don't believe in this yet. Let's talk about a crazy dream. Please listen to the crazy dream is what I said. Just think that it was a gigantic dream and forget about it. That's how I started off. But after that, in half a year's time, we are moving forward very steadily. And from Mongolia, we have representatives from Busan as well, and from Kitakyushu, and from the United States, Europe, from different parts of the world. We have people here all interested. So from now on, we want people in the government to don't think of just small things. Look at it from a global, large perspective to see how we can recover the economy in Japan and resolve problems. So don't look at small points. And one thing related to R&D, we need to first identify the issues. We need a research institute. Now we have the vision. Now we need to move to the next step to identify issues, and we need technical review by experts to be able to move forward. So that's why there was a signature in MOU on joint research between JREF and JTEC, and today that we'll have the actual signing. And also, together with JREF and the National Renewable Energy Center of Mongolia, there will be also the signing of MOU. So we'd like to shake hands. Thank you. So we need research institutes, government, and business to be part of this. And we are very pleased that we're able to have an MOU with 2 entities on joint research. Now we need a business to be involved with Korea, electric company KEPCO, and we, SoftBank, and we with the Mongolian Newcom Group. Between the 3 of us, we are to have an MOU on strategic partnership. And we have agreed to the MOU on that, the 3 parties. So as for how much and when and in what form, we don't have the details yet on the investment, but the 3 parties, Japan, Mongolia, and Korea, the 3 countries will be working on a strategic partnership. That's the basic agreement. So we want to first see how we can work together with first wind power generation in Mongolia, and not just wind, but look at other renewable energy sources as well to see what we can work together on. So, as the Wright brothers, they had a dream of flying in the sky. They started off with a dream. And the internet started off from a dream as well. And electricity and power also, from this huge problem that we had, from this huge headache that we had. We now started off from a crazy idea, and we're moving it to practice. And we need to next commercialize that. I'm not an inventor nor a politician. So I cannot invent things. I cannot come up with legislation, but my role is to make it happen. So take action and realize it. I want to make sure that it will be realized. So I want to continue on till my death, even if I cannot realize it by the time I die, maybe 50 years, 100 years, 300 years ahead for a future generation. I'm sure that somebody will follow and continue with the effort. So in the past 100 years, there were wars seeking for energy. There were conflicts. There were so many wars that took place because of energy. And the biggest reason for wars that took place in the past 100 years, majority cause, was all energy. Everybody was beating for energy. And that led to war. So, we are blessed with renewable energy. We have the sun, we have the wind. We don't need to try to grab it from somebody else. We can share it with each other. We can help each other. And we don't have to burden the earth. We can, in harmony with birds and flowers, live a wonderful life. We don't need any wars for energy. We don't need to have some stupid thing occur, such as war. And no radiation either. No nuclear. So we, for our children and for our grandchildren and for the future generation in mankind, we have a huge responsibility. So let's really work together. Thank you.
Mr. Son, thank you very much for all those wonderful words. And when I was listening to you, you are an executor. You are an implementer of dreams. And of course, we have to have an entrepreneurship. We have to be practical and implement this idea step by step. Thank you very much. So, and lastly, so in the area of energy in Japan, I have to call upon the wise man, and that is Professor Kenji Yamaji. My name is Yamaji. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. Summary? Can I really summarize what all the other speakers have said? That is just impossible. And of course, I could criticize, but I really cannot criticize what Mr. Son, the president and founder of this organization, has said. But I had thought that I had known everything about Desertec and Newcom or what's happening in Mongolia. I thought Mongolia was full of coal, but not about the other resources, particularly renewables. So thank you very much for all the news pieces of information that you've given me. So you are the visionary, Mr. Son. I think that, in a way, is your role, and I love challengers. And concerning details. We have to go down to the nitty-gritty, but let's put that aside. So when we are talking about a vision and talking about the Asian super grid, there is something that I do remember. There was a Mr. Kuwano, president of Sanyo, who had this Genesis concept or Genesis program. So to link up the grid all over the world based upon superconductivity, a superconductive interconnection. So, and then that could meet together in India too. But so through that, the weakness, the vulnerability of PV panel, which is that it cannot generate electricity unless there's sunlight, could be offset or could be removed. So, in a way, Mr. Son, you have followed in his footsteps, and I, as an engineer, I, as a professor, would like to provide the technology to attain your dream. And of course, we don't have much time for discussion, but there's just a couple of points, if I may make. First, network. Just because it's networks, we cannot remove all of the volatility of renewable electricity generation. And of course, as you mentioned, it is not possible to store a very large amount of electricity. Another is the Euro-Quebec hydrogen program. And as you know, Quebec has a very large dam for hydroelectricity generation. And I think that again is a similar program. And in Argentina, in Patagonia, there is an area for wind power. However, there is no city that could consume the wind power generated. So why I'm thinking of these various projects, hydrogen you could store. Electricity, maybe you think can be easily transported. But if you switch, but it is very difficult to transmit electricity a long distance, particularly if it's alternate current. So the amount of electricity that can be transmitted is quite low. So therefore, it has to be not AC, but DC, direct current. For example, ABB, that would be the, I think, high temperature direct current transmission. I think to carry electricity at in great distance, I think that has to be at a lower temperature. So sorry, I just forgot what I wanted to say. But so hydrogen plus the DC transmission might be two elements that could be put together. Super energy pipeline. So hydrogen could be turned into liquid hydrogen, could be at very low temperature. And magnesium and boron could be utilized there. And it means that to cool the transmission lines based upon the hydrogen, the liquid hydrogen available, then and I think based upon your vision, Mr. Son, it's up to the engineers to realize, to crystallize the idea and to provide the technology. So for a certain project, you have to be zealous, you have to be excited, but then on our part, the engineers have to be cool-headed. That's it from me. Thank you very much for that summarization. Any further comments? When one tries to implement a project, of course there's going to be problems, there are going to be challenges. There is no project that I have been involved in without any challenges, without any obstacles. But unless you have a dream, you're not going to go forward. So, So based upon your advice, Professor Yamaji, I would like to move forward, but it is a challenge that I would like to move forward with.
Thank
you very much for those discussion, and particularly from the participants from Mongolia and also from Europe. I think we were able to have a very good discussion, although we did surpass the time allotted to this particular session. But I hope the audience too enjoyed and had your fill of the various ideas put forth. The break time will be much shorter than was originally planned for, but this is the end of session number 5. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that zealous discussion, and then we did go over time. So let's take a 10-minute break and please return to the conference. So let's start the closing plenary from 4:05. 4:05. Thank you very much.
以上をもちましてセッション5を終了いたします。